Oh, so what I like to do is just introduce our own Dr. Gloria, who will be the moderator for this morning. We'd like for you to put any questions you have in the chat, and Josue and I will be monitoring the chat. And so that when our presenter is ready to have dialogue, Dr. Gloria and her will kind of, keep that part moving. So let's get going, and welcome and God bless.
Thank you, Mrs. Weatherby Flowers. I'm delighted to be here this morning to host this particular panel. Let me just say a few words about Dr. Isha Metzger. She is an assistant professor at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, but she actually comes to Atlanta via Sierra Leone in West Africa. If you've ever been to West Africa, you know that it is a very beautiful, beautiful part of the world. And she is a licensed clinical psychologist. She's the founder and director of the Empower Lab. She is the owner of Cultural Concepts, LLC. She's a certified therapist in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Her resume is extensive. I don't want to go on and on about the amount of grant funding she's been able to secure and all of her publications, because I know you want to hear from her. I must tell you that she's a little under the weather, and so she's asked to not be on camera today. So I hope you will give her both grace and space, because she is still going to present us with some powerful information. So Dr. Metzger, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. That was an excellent introduction. I am going to work on keeping my energy up this morning. I'm really excited to be here to speak with you all, for those of you who are joining live and for those of you who will be watching this recording on your own time. I do want to present some slides and share some information about ways to heal both interpersonal and racial trauma for Black youth. The focus of my presentation today will be on racial socialization as a protective process. I do want to take a second to pause. Annie or the host, are you able to enable participant screen sharing? I do have some slides that I want to show.
Absolutely. Give me one moment.
Awesome. Especially since you won't see my face today. There are some images that I think will help facilitate our conversation.
There you are.
Perfect. Okay. Gloria, can I get a nod if you can see these slides? Yes, okay. So I am able to see you all on my screen, as well as I'm able to see the chat. So as Annie mentioned, please feel free to use that chat and we'll facilitate our conversation this way. But as I mentioned, I will be focusing on both interpersonal and racial trauma as they impact Black youth, with an emphasis on racial socialization, or the talk, or the series of practices that Black caregivers engage in to protect Black youth from these experiences with interpersonal and racial stress and trauma. I first want to start by saying I don't have any conflicts to disclose. As Dr. Latson-Billings did suggest, I do have some grant funding, but that funding did not stipulate any results, and those agencies are not depending on the results of my research. This is a two-part discussion that I'd like to have. The first part is to really present the foundation around the strategies that we're going to be talking about here in the second half. So I'll do an introduction to interpersonal trauma and an overview on racial stressors as they impact Black youth. And then I do want to provide an introduction to racial socialization before focusing on some very brief results from community-based participatory research that I do think has quite a bit of relevance for Black youth, as well as for those of you who are caregivers of Black youth or practitioners engaging Black youth in any form of mental health, treatment, or service provision. The second part of our discussion today will focus on integrating racial socialization in the clinical care or the service provision that you're currently engaging in. And then I'm going to leave you all with a lot of resources to continue this conversation and to continue these kind of strategies within your respective roles, whether that be, again, as caregiver or practitioner. And then, as I mentioned, I do want you to be able to use the chat to feel free to jump off of mute. Certainly, we have Dr. Latson Billings here to facilitate the discussion as well. However, I will leave some time at the end today for any remaining questions and discussion that we'd like to have. So with that, I do have 3 ground rules for today. The first one I've already alluded to, so that's actively contribute to the discussion. So this can be largely lecture format, but as you are comfortable, I do encourage you to use the chat and to jump off mute. There are some readings and resources available in a Google Drive link. These are all free to you all as participants. I will drop this in the chat here shortly. The second rule that I have is to lean into any discomfort that you feel and to ask any questions that you might have. This discomfort might come as a result of our discussion around racial stress, racial trauma, and racism, or if you are trained in any cognitive and behavioral therapies, this discomfort might be in relation to some of the discussion that we have around typical therapy delivery and how it can be invalidating for Black youth and families. And finally, I just ask that we uphold confidentiality. So any personal examples or experiences that are shared, please keep them in this meeting room, as well as for those of you who are viewing asynchronously, please keep any personal and private information as such. So I do want to start by providing a personal introduction, I think, that will expand upon Dr. Latson Billings' introduction of me. And that is to provide kind of a background for the work that I do, as well as why I do the work that I do. But also, I do think that quite a bit of my research is me-search, in that it does, well, it did start certainly as a kind of personal quest into understanding some of the experiences that I had in my early upbringing, as well as those that were protective and those that could have been detrimental to my development. So with that, I do want to just kind of orient you to Sierra Leone that Dr. Latson Billings mentioned. It is the country highlighted in the yellow here. Excuse me, on the westernmost coast of Africa. We are known for our abundant natural resources, our exports, like gold, iron ore, and platinum. We do boast 7 of the world's most beautiful beaches as well. Sierra Leone, also, if you're familiar with the country, is known for our diamond trade, as well as a civil war that plagued the country in the 80s. This newspaper clipping says that it was about 8 years, but it was actually, if you think about the civil unrest as well as the reconstruction that took place, about 20 years that this civil war devastated the country of Sierra Leone. It was particularly detrimental for youth in the country, as rebel soldiers took up arms and amputated the limbs of elders in the community in order to force and to coerce Sierra Leonean youth to participate as child soldiers in their army. So as mentioned, this was particularly devastating for those youth who were still in Sierra Leone. For those of us who were fortunate enough to flee to Guinea and Senegal and to neighboring countries, others were also fortunate enough to come to the United States. My family being one of those. We came to College Park, Georgia, which is where I grew up. If you're familiar with College Park, it is south of the airport, and like many major cities, I think, south of whether it be the railroad tracks or like I mentioned, the airport. Some cities have a perimeter surrounding their metropolitan area, and typically the south side is the more urban, less affluent, under-resourced area. I certainly didn't know that I was growing up in the hood until I left. And I certainly didn't form my first relationships with white people even until middle school, or until elementary school rather. So this is a kind of lighthearted depiction of the interpersonal interactions that I was having with individuals at school. So I mentioned growing up south of the airport in College Park. I was also a part of a system and a program called the M2M program that allowed me to be bused from College Park to north of the perimeter to Sandy Springs. That is more affluent, certainly provided access to extracurricular activities for myself and my siblings, as well as, like I mentioned, these interpersonal relationships. What you don't see, in addition to the microaggressions that I was experiencing, are kind of the systemic stressors that I was facing. I certainly remember my dad coming up to the school and advocating for me, and talking to school administrators about my language fluency and vocabulary acquisition. Of course, he wasn't using those words. He was really saying, there's nothing wrong with my daughter, and in fact, she's smarter than all of you. So this was just him, doing his best to advocate for me. But now, as I built my vocabulary and as my experiences within the system have grown, I know that he was either attending a 504 meeting or talking about an IEP plan that they were trying to make for me, and really advocating for me and making sure that I stayed in general education. But if we think about other Black youth within the system, certainly if they don't have advocates, we do know, right, that Black youth are more likely to be placed in special ed for behavioral problems than they are for intellectual difficulties. If we think back to when schools were doing college prep versus technical prep, we do know, right, that Black youth were more likely to be placed on technical prep than college prep. So certainly these early experiences within the system helped build my vocabulary, and certainly impacted the ways in which I was developing. What you see here is a very small subset of my family, a very small subset of an organization that my dad started, called ASLE, the Association for Sierra Leoneans in Georgia. And similar to what you guys are likely doing at the school, in addition to supplementing our American history books with African history books, we engaged in African drum classes and cooking classes, and we put on plays, and we had fundraisers for family members and community members who were trying to come from Sierra Leone to neighboring countries and to the United States as well. But certainly building up our vocabulary even at an early age about our heritage and our background, and even role playing. What do you do if somebody calls you a racial slur? And what do you do if you're pulled over by the police, for example? These early experiences all built my racial identity. They built my sense of self, and they also prepared me to navigate society as an African in America, as an ethnically minoritized individual. as I progressed throughout my undergraduate and graduate studies, my vocabulary around these instances of what I now know are interpersonal stressors and traumatic experiences like fleeing a war-torn country as a refugee, but also other traumatic experiences like sexual assault and physical abuse and witnessing domestic violence became relevant to me, as well as, right, these ongoing racial stressors that we know continuously and compound their impact on Black youth. So these are things that we'll talk about today, including experiences with microaggressions, with individual and vicarious racism, as well as historical racism and how these impact our trust of the system, our willingness to engage in available services, and our ability to interact with mental health providers. So I won't go too far into my educational background and training besides to say that on internship at the Medical University of South Carolina, as well as at postdoc at the National Crime Victims Center and at Yale University, that I began to really use my clinical skills and my research background to implement and to train providers on implementing trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy in a way that is culturally appropriate and validating for Black youth. I currently am at Georgia State University, where I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I am also trained in TFCBT. I am a provider as well as a trainer for other providers in TFCBT. And that's the lens that I bring to you today. Whereas you can see from my business logo, I do continue to consider cultural differences, cultural similarities, and cultural strengths that individuals, that families, and that communities have that they can leverage towards making sure that Black youth are thriving and really functioning at their highest capacity despite these ongoing experiences with both interpersonal and racial trauma. So with that, I do see that we've had a few participants join us. So I want to provide the opportunity for you. Feel free to use the chat. Feel free to jump off mute to just briefly introduce yourselves with your name, your role, and your position, whether that be caregiver, whether that be mental health clinician, whether that be researcher or student, as well as how long you've worked with youth and in what capacity. So again, that could be as a clinician, as an educator, as a parent, as a sibling, or as a community member. And any strategies that you're currently using to help youth cope with racial stressors. So that could be anything from just validating them to listening to them to websites that you are used to sharing with them, or any concrete cognitive or behavioral strategies or therapies that you're using. And then last, you can feel free to share any questions that you have for today while you're introducing yourself. And again, you can feel free to use the chat for this portion as well as we continue with our discussion. So I'm going to go on mute for, let's say, a couple seconds just to give you guys a chance to introduce yourselves and to blow my nose really quickly.
So while our presenter is taking care of some things, please feel free to just at least put your name and your role. Let's get those things in, put them in the chat for us.
Thanks, Gloria. So the new names that I see are, we have Abby, Corinda. Hi, Abby. Okay, a librarian. Awesome. Hi, Corinda. Hi, Mary. Thanks for joining us today. Feel free, as you have any questions that come up, please. I see you're using the chat. Joshua. Oh, and Corinda, you're 30 years in. Yes. So feel free as I go through today's discussion, if you have any experiences that you would like to share and contribute, that would be great. Awesome. Awesome. So if you're currently working with youth, I definitely think that this discussion will be relevant to you in terms of just ways that you will be able to supplement any other care that they're receiving. Certainly you're in a great position, Corinda, to serve as an ally and as an advocate for these youth who you are volunteering with in school. Great. So I'm going to continue with our discussion of interpersonal trauma and what that looks like. So right now, oh, excellent, Corinda. Right now, we do know that 60% of youth are reporting either experiencing or witnessing at least one stressful event each year. And these numbers are actually from prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we do know that these experiences with interpersonal stressors, or we can call them ACEs, as you might be familiar with that terminology. So adverse childhood experiences that can potentially lead to trauma responses. We do know that 15% of youth experience more than 6 stressful events in their year, each year. And we also know that Black youth are experiencing interpersonal stressors at higher rates than their white American and even their Hispanic counterparts. So these types of stressors that it's important for us to assess for and to be on the lookout for, as we know they are impacting Black youth, include those things that I've already mentioned, like sexual assault and abuse, but also emotional abuse. If you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, certainly unexpected loss of family members can lead to complicated grief. Certainly loss of housing, job instability, problems that caregivers are having with employment have been impacting youth as well. And for those caregivers who are working from home, youth have started to see and started to report an increase in witnessing domestic violence as well. I mentioned war and refugee status as being a stressful experience that can lead to trauma responses. And I do want to talk about what those trauma responses look like. So as you are interacting with kids in school, at the library, as you're interacting with kids in your community and your day-to-day lives, you're able to acknowledge and recognize these interpersonal stressors and intervene on them and assist the kids in seeking the help that they need and even providing behavioral strategies that will help benefit them as they heal from those. So different symptoms that you should be on the lookout for are those that are related to depression. So those things like sadness, hopelessness, and helplessness, withdrawing from social activities, anxieties, fears, worries, so ruminating, having distressing thoughts, anger, low self-esteem, suicidality, self-injury are all internalizing problems that we should be on the lookout for, as well as those externalizing problems. In terms of Black youth, we do know that these externalizing problems are often the ones that lead to disproportionate penalization at school. So suspensions, expulsions, being written up, and as I mentioned, even placed into special ed. So these are behaviors like aggression, non-compliance, inappropriate or early sexualized behaviors, unsafe sex, those kids who are hyperactive and unable to concentrate in class even can be experiencing interpersonal stressors. So again, this is important to make note of so that we're not incorrectly diagnosing kids, so that we're not incorrectly labeling kids as being right oppositional, defiant, as having ADHD, as having some of these externalizing diagnoses, when it could just be that they are having these responses as it pertains to the interpersonal stressors that they are experiencing. So the question then becomes, how can experiencing these interpersonal stressors lead to these symptoms that I just mentioned? So these externalizing and internalizing problems. The example that I have for you today is thinking about ongoing physical and emotional abuse. Well, we can certainly replace this stressor with any of the other stressors, so sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence, and see how trauma is also impacting the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of, in this case, Black youth. This is to say, if you are experiencing ongoing physical and emotional abuse, you might have inaccurate thoughts that nobody loves me, I'm worthless. This could be because of being directly told that no one loves you and that you're worthless, or just based on not experiencing typical proactive, healthy interactions with your caregivers or loved ones. Also, if you're modeled um, hitting, if you are hit by your caregiver, it's likely that you're going to develop these inaccurate thoughts that if you're upset with someone, you hit them. And of course, this can lead to these harmful behaviors like aggression and acting out physically. We also know that experiencing ongoing physical and emotional abuse can lead to impacts to our self-esteem, our self-worth, and our confidence, as well as problems with emotion regulation. So if you have a caregiver who's not able to regulate their emotions, of course, that wouldn't be modeled for you appropriately, but also you're not provided with those opportunities to practice and to role play and to engage in emotion regulation. So these are the kiddos who you might see in class who a very little incident can lead to them exploding or lead to them becoming very upset and not easily calm down. That's likely because they haven't had those opportunities to practice in their day-to-day lives. And again, ongoing physical and emotional abuse can lead to risky behaviors like actually perpetrating that violence that they have been modeled. Also, associating with more deviant peers, whether that be because you think that your old peer groups don't understand you, or whether that just be because of a natural tendency to associate with those who are engaging in similar behaviors. Also, increased substance use can be, again, as a result of your deviant peer groups, but also as a attempt to cope. It's a maladaptive coping. It's a distraction that these kiddos are engaging in substance use because of, but it's important to be aware of kind of the impact that ongoing physical and emotional abuse can have on these youth in terms of um, leading them to increase substance use as well. So we do know that for those youth who experience these ongoing and pervasive interpersonal stressors, they can develop PTSD. For those youth who don't develop PTSD, for those who you're interacting with at schools, in the libraries, in your communities, it's also important to know that whether or not they meet full criteria for PTSD, they're likely exhibiting some of these symptoms. So some of these symptoms include re-experiencing, so having recurrent distressing memories. These are those kiddos who might have flashbacks of their interpersonal traumas. Also arousal and reactivity. So we talked about acting out previously, but these are kiddos who are hypervigilant. They might have exaggerated startle responses. They're easily on guard, or they're seen to be on high alert, right? That's likely because they're protecting against unpredictable stressors in their day-to-day lives. Concentration and sleep problems also happen as they are, again, either re-experiencing or ruminating on their ongoing stressors. These kiddos also might note problems either falling asleep or problems staying asleep. So these kiddos might have nightmares, for example, when they do fall asleep. Negative emotions are important to identify and to intervene upon. These are things like reduced interest, becoming detached from things that they um, typically find enjoyable. These are things like no longer wanting to engage in extracurricular activities or engage in raising their hand in class, for example. So simple day-to-day tasks that they typically engage in. They might physically start to avoid different thoughts, feelings, people, for example, adults, people in charge, um, as a result of their traumatic experiences. So that was a brief overview into trauma, what it looks like for youth, how we can identify trauma, and the importance of understanding the symptoms that youth are experiencing and not pathologizing them, not labeling them, and certainly not misdiagnosing them before you have a complete and comprehensive understanding of the traumatic experiences that they are likely encountering. So specific to Black youth, it's important to take into account the racial stressors that they're likely also experiencing. So these racial stressors are dangerous or frightening race-based experiences that do overwhelm our coping capacity and do lead to these outcomes like hopelessness, horror, sadness, and anger as well. Throughout today's presentation, you will see vocabulary that is used to facilitate discussion. Certainly, as you're interacting with the Black youth in schools, in your libraries, the resources that I'm going to share with you, one of them are the Care Package for Racial Healing that includes this vocabulary as well. So these are resources for you to be able to facilitate conversation around racial stress and trauma and around coping strategies with the Black youth who you interact with. Excuse me. In terms of incidents, we do know that marginalized, ethnically minoritized BIPOC groups are more likely to experience racial stressors. So in terms of the prevalence, we do know that youth as young as 8 are reporting on average 5 daily experiences with racial stressors. And up to 90% are reporting experiences racial stressors each week. So that's to say, in addition to these interpersonal stressors, we do know that Black youth are experiencing compounding and exacerbating experiences with racial stressors as well. These experiences can be due to an individual experience or due to ongoing collective experiences. We're going to talk about that here shortly in terms of the ways in which they can be experienced, whether that be directly or vicariously. So that means witnessed or watched in your community, on the news or social media, but otherwise through someone else. We do know, similar to interpersonal stressor and how that can lead to PTSD, we do know that racial stressors can range in impact from stressful to traumatic. And though in those cases, it leads to racial trauma. So this is the one slide that I have that contains a trigger warning. And this is to depict the many different types and the compounding impact of racial stressors that Black youth and Black adults in our communities are experiencing. So the first being internalized racism. This is important to understand, important to assess for, important to discuss with caregivers as it pertains to their socialization practices. So internalized racism in this case is referring to corporal punishment. What you see on the screen is a caregiver who's given a command and following 1, 2, 3. If that command isn't obliged, then typically corporal punishment follows. This we do know is a result of Black caregivers protecting their youth from outside consequences and outside disparities that they are experiencing in their consequences. That can be, as I mentioned before, being suspended or being expelled, but also as they grow and develop, we do know that their experiences in the justice system are disproportionate to where they're experiencing longer sentencing, more severe consequences and fines even. And certainly we do know that Black youth and Black adults are also experiencing death at the hands of law enforcement. So these are practices that Black caregivers engage in. It's also important to, when we're talking about corporal punishment, emphasize that Black caregivers aren't the only ones who spank their kids, but again, they are the ones who are typically stigmatized for that spanking, and they are typically the ones who are reported and who get involved in social services. So it's our job as providers, as mandated reporters, whether we're volunteering in schools or working at libraries, whether we're mental health clinicians or social workers, to be very certain that we're talking to caregivers about our roles and responsibilities as mandated reporters, as well as the laws in our cities and our states around corporal punishment. So do we make reports if you spank your kid? Do we make reports if you spank your kid with an object? Or do we make reports if you spank your kids with an object and it leaves a mark? Right, so just having these nuanced conversations is often what builds trust with caregivers. It opens up lines of communications. It makes your work together more transparent and more useful. And this is what typically results in them being able to stay engaged in the services that you're providing. Microaggressions are those ambivalent, kind of ambiguous, day-to-day interactions that violate our personhood, that are either veiled compliments, if you think about micro insults, or they are like micro assaults, which are kind of the old-fashioned racist jokes that people might tell. It's important to validate these experiences that Black youth and caregivers might be experiencing, but also to provide those kind of comebacks or those behavioral responses. So what do you say if someone says, you're well-spoken for a Black girl, or you're pretty for a Black girl, right? What does that mean about the ways that other Black people speak or look? And how do you respond in a way that validates your personhood, allows you to take up for yourself, and reduces some of the rumination and anxiety and depression that might result? It's also important to educate youth on individual instances of racism that they might be encountering, so that they're not internalizing these instances as something that is a result of them or their personal characteristics, but that they are appropriately attributing their interactions to racism, right? So no, it's not that you're lazy, that you're dumb, that you don't have anything to contribute, but it's likely that you're the only Black person in your class, for example, that is leading these individuals to leave you off of group projects, to say that you can't play with them, to lead your teacher even to not recognize you after you raise your hand multiple times. We also know that these instances of individual racism are now becoming vicarious, where in this case, Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper, Amy weaponized the police and said that she was going to tell the police a Black man was trying to kill her, when all he did, we saw it on video, was ask her to put her dog on a leash. This is vicarious racism in that, in the case of Armand Arbery and Breonna Taylor, we've seen these individuals die on the news and on social media, and we are vicariously victimized by these experiences, particularly as we're oftentimes caught off guard. We're scrolling through social media for some sort of escape, some sort of positive social interaction, when we are accosted with these images of Black death. Environmentally, we know that as we interact in our day-to-day lives, we are seeing racist statues, racist imagery, racist messaging that can ultimately impact our interactions as well. We also can think about the ways in which engaging in peaceful protests in response to environmental racism can lead to, again, these disproportionate consequences. We know that you're more likely to get arrested as a Black person protesting than as a white person. We know that I talked about kind of college prep versus technical prep and special education. We also know that there's a foster care to prison pipeline, that there's a prison pipeline for Black families and Black youth and Black adults as well, that leads to them being disproportionately penalized. Systemically and structurally, it's important to think about the ways in which we are victimized in our day-to-day lives across the systems and structures that we interact with. As we are thinking about reactions that we're having to these other forms of racism, knowing that we have different privileges around even being able to engage socially and being able to enact social change. So it's really important to talk to our youth and talk to our caregivers about staying informed and staying engaged systemically and structurally so that we can continue to combat the historical racism and the historical trauma that takes place. So this is to say, right, this picture is before the pandemic, and this is to say that we were wearing face masks to protests even before the pandemic, because we do know that law enforcement is likely to use gas on BLM protests and to protests of Black issues than they are to protests of white issues. We know that we're writing down the names of bail bondsmen on our hands so that we're able to fight and able to utilize the justice system in a way that can hopefully protect us ultimately as we are continuing to navigate these racial stressors and to attempt to eradicate anti-Black racism. But that is to say that as we are experiencing these racial stressors on kind of day-to-day and minute instances, all the way up to these historical and more pervasive and systemic instances of racism, that we are having these reactions to racial stressors that are similar to those that we have in response to interpersonal stressors. So these internal dilemmas, these questions like, should I do or say something? If I do, will it make it worse? Will I be told that I'm overreacting? Should I have been able to speak up? The last time I spoke up, I got written up for being non-compliant or for talking back, for example. Those questions that we have about, did I hear what I think I heard? Do they mean what I think they meant? Those thoughts that we have about things never changing and there not being anything that we can do to change or to impact those who are viewing us negatively do lead to these very similar psychological consequences like anxiety, depression, those same problems, sleeping, diminished confidence, helplessness, a loss of drive, and these intrusive thoughts and these strains that we're having to our ability to concentrate, for example. And very much like PTSD, we do know that racial stressors can lead to racial trauma. And in the very same way, being exposed or threatened to death or serious injury or violence because of your racial and ethnic background can lead to re-experiencing. So that can look like reporting stressors like discrimination in higher numbers, having those flashbacks about those experiences that you've either had or witnessed, being irritable, being aggressive, having exaggerated startle, thinking about those who are hypervigilant, those who are on guard against racism, those who have reduced interest, those who are detached, right? So are these Black youth antisocial, or are they avoiding their white peers and their white classmates because of previous negative interactions that they've had in school, for example? Are they avoiding extracurricular activities? Are they avoiding raising their hand because they feel like they've been raising their hand and not getting called on? Are they disengaging from group projects because they're not getting the recognitions that they deserve? Or are they just disengaged? So it's really important to assess for and to be on the lookout for these racial stressors as they are impacting the outcomes of Black youth. However, we do know that all hope is not lost. We do know that Black families are all engaging in a series of conversations that allow Black youth to thrive and to succeed despite these instances of both interpersonal and racial stress and trauma. So before I start the discussion of racial socialization, I like to provide an overview on just socialization in general. So socialization is the process of just raising your kids to navigate society and to be healthy and whole. So these are things like safety messages, like don't put your finger in the socket, you'll get shocked. Don't touch the stove, it's hot. Look both ways before you cross the street, right? So these are common messages that we know, as well as, right, the conversation around the birds and the bees that's more intricate and more complicated, but that all caregivers typically try to engage in. So the birds and the bees is one that's similar to racial socialization. It's two parts. So it's the part that is to bolster your kids' identity, to allow them to select healthy partners, to allow them to learn how to negotiate condom use, for example. Also, the kind of second part of that is to protect against potential downfalls. So to protect against STDs, to protect against unhealthy relationships. So how do you identify a healthy partner? What do you say if someone, for example, says that they're allergic to latex? How do you negotiate condom use? So racial socialization is a very similar process that caregivers engage in to transmit the behaviors, the values, and the attitudes of their ethnic group in order to help the kiddos navigate society as ethnically minoritized individuals. So again, this is two-part as well. I'm going to talk to you shortly about the 6 different components of racial socialization, but it is to bolster our individual identity as well as to prepare for the barriers that we might face. Racial socialization is linked to improved outcomes from increased and improved self-esteem and racial identity. So more positive thoughts about your racial and ethnic group, more positive thoughts about the ways in which others perceive your racial and ethnic group, and more central thoughts. So more importance and more pride placed around your ethnic background as opposed to shame or guilt or thoughts about being lazy or dangerous or whatever it is that racism might otherwise have you believe about yourself. Racial socialization are those messages that help combat that. Racial socialization also leads to improved academic achievement and job performance, as well as increased psychological resilience. So just our innate ability to overcome these stressors and overcome life's challenges. We often talk about racial socialization as a talk, but we do know that it's more than a talk. So yes, it's oral communication, but it's also modeling, role playing, exposure. So things like taking your kids to an African American museum, things like cooking African dishes with your family, things like role playing. What do you do if someone calls you a racial slur? Or what do you do if you get pulled over by the police? So these are all different ways that we convey racial socialization messages and ways that we, again, protect our youth against these negative experiences and bolster their racial identity. So as I mentioned, most Black families are already practicing racial socialization. It's important to talk to Black youth about the types of practices and conversations that they're currently having, and to assess for and to make sure that you in your respective roles are supplementing their messages and providing them resources to continue having these conversations around race, around racism, around racial identity and coping. So the first type of racial socialization message are those racial pride messages. So those are the ones that teach about our heritage, our history, and our culture to promote group unity and combat negative experiences. So I gave the example earlier about reading African history books, in addition to the typical American history books. But these are also things like identifying Black role models. These are things to make up for a lack of representation, to make up for negative representation that is seen across the news and the media. These are messages and strategies that allow youth to really become proud of their ethnic background so that they can combat. When I say combat, I mean just challenge those negative messagings, right? So if you see Black youth talked about on the news and all you see are their mugshots, for example, you're more likely to think about Black people as criminals or as violent or as deviant. Whereas if that's being combated with these positive imagery and positive messaging and positive themes and experiences, then Black youth are less likely to internalize those negative messages that they do see. Racial barrier messages. Yes, Abby, I love that. Also to push back against erasure. So that's the same, right? As they are looking at these pop culture, as they're looking at the media, as they're looking at their textbook and their history books that otherwise might not represent them, or in this case, erase them completely. Our job is to combat that and to provide those positive images. Racial barrier messages are those that concretely provide strategies that prepare us for and allow us to cope from and heal despite these experiences with racial stressors. So these are the ones that say, if you are pulled over by the police, this is what you do. If you go to a sleepover with your white classmates, don't go anywhere around the house by yourself. These are messages, again, that say, if you're followed around a store, for example, what do you do? Here are Black-owned stores that we can shop at. But also it's ways to respond by asking, is there anything that I can help you with? Are you here to help me? Ways that you can respond in the moment. Racial achievement messages are those that focus on the need to work twice as hard, to be rewarded the same, to be recognized the same, to get the same grades or the same raise, for example, or the same pay, for example. So those are those messages that say you do negotiate your first job. You do raise your hand twice as much despite not being called on. You do go to the teacher after class and talk to them about your grade if you do not receive a grade that you think is reflective of your performance. You do persist despite these ongoing barriers that you might be facing academically, or in the workplace once these kiddos do start to get jobs. Spirituality and religion messages are those that promote strength, resilience, and empowerment. It's really important to assess for where your kiddos are getting their strength from. It's important to talk to them about their beliefs around spirituality and religion so that you can encourage them along whatever path it is that they're taking, and so that you can utilize our cognitive behavioral strategies in a way that's relevant for them. So maybe we're not talking about mindfulness and meditation, but we're emphasizing prayer and giving thanks. Maybe we're reminding clients who don't want to take up on a referral for mental health treatment that God helps those who help themselves, or faith without works is dead. So just using racial socialization as a way to encourage engagement in services, to encourage proactive responses to stressors, and to make our strategies more relevant and more beneficial for the kiddos and the caregivers that we're interacting with. Appreciation of extended family involvement is a racial socialization theme that's really important to emphasize as you're working with Black kids. That's to say that some of you might be their extended family members. Some of you certainly have access to and can help them explore extended family members who can help them as they are navigating these interpersonal and racial stressors. So it's not just mom and dad and your siblings and your nuclear family, but it's also your cousins and your play cousins and your big mamas. And for myself, it was the candy lady down the street. For others, it might be their barbers or their hairstylists. It might be the cafeteria lady, or it might be Corinda, you as a volunteer in high school. You might become a member of their extended family. So it is important to remember the impact that you all, as well as other community members, can have on these developing youth. And as you're talking about behavioral strategies and coping responses, it's important to think about how even friends and peers can become extended family members who can help these youth navigate their stressors. And last, racial equality messages are those that emphasize that all races are equal and should live together peacefully. So this is important, as racism would otherwise have us separate, as racism would otherwise have us avoiding majority populations. It's important to assess for their views and their values around racial equality so that they can utilize allies, so that they can utilize and identify advocates, so that they can celebrate diversity in appropriate ways despite ongoing experiences with racial stressors. So very briefly, I did look at your roles here as you are working in libraries and high schools. I do want to present not the methods of any of my research, but certainly some of the results from community-based participatory research that I do think has some implications for the ways in which we're engaging Black youth and Black families in our services. As a summary, we do know that Black youth are more likely to experience trauma, including racism and discrimination, and to suffer from mental and behavioral health consequences. However, we also know that they are more likely to utilize these cultural strengths that often leave us more resilient, more successful, more engaging within our families and our communities. So it's important to keep in mind racial socialization as we are thinking about the fact that mental health treatment does exist, but Black youth are less likely to initiate, to complete, and to benefit from mental health treatment. So the question then becomes, how can we in our various roles utilize these strategies and utilize our roles to engage Black youth in our services and to keep them resilient and able to cope from or cope with their ongoing stressors. So I have conducted research. As I mentioned, I am trained in TFCBT, and I have an extensive program of research on the treatment components and on the benefit of TFCBT. But we do know that TFCBT should take into account culturally specific risk factors, so racial stress and trauma, as well as culturally specific protective processes like racial socialization, in order to overcome barriers to treatment and in order to encourage more sustained and more positive outcomes just from their day-to-day interactions with you all, whether or not they're engaged in treatment. So the study that I want to briefly discuss the results of is a mixed method study that sought to understand barriers and facilitators. So things that prevented as well as things that could encourage service utilization at community mental health facilities. So I did this research at Children's Advocacy Centers. So these are community-based organizations that treat, investigate, and seek to prevent child abuse and neglect. I did this research at a CAC because it allowed us to identify organizational needs that are common to other community-based organizations like hospitals, like schools, like libraries, like any organization that seeks to provide services or to provide benefits to, in this case, Black youth and families. This CAC did serve, right, all different ethnicities. So, and we were able to do a chart review of individuals who were referred for services, and we were able to see that Black clients, Black youth, missed significantly more forensic interview sessions than their white and their Hispanic counterparts. We saw that Black clients attended significantly fewer treatment sessions than their white counterparts. And we also saw that they were significantly less likely to graduate treatment than white clients. These findings weren't surprising, however. The main part of this study and the main goal of this study was to conduct key informant interviews with caregivers of referred youth to figure out what it was about the services that were either barriers, again, what prevented them from coming in, and what facilitators existed that could encourage them to continue receiving services. They said things like uninformative treatment referrals. So you told me to come to your facility, but no one told me why. There were investigations or there were assessments done, but I didn't receive any results of those assessments. Also, they mentioned having fewer providers of colors. So this is just to say, if you are a provider of color and you're able to help facilitate any conversations, any communication, any results that you're able to help track down and provide, any information, what we can see that caregivers are saying is that they were less likely to engage in services due to a lack of information. So that could be information, again, around why questions are being asked, why they're being referred to services, making sure that if you are advertising your services, that you are advertising them to Black families in a way that provides information about what problems they might be experiencing. And again, I will provide resources for you all at the end that talk about ways to provide information at the same time as you are being welcoming to individuals who either need to engage in your organization, who can come to the library. So for example, there's public health messaging campaigns that we have freely available that you can just hang up on your library doors or even put as a yard sound out front that talk about racial stress and trauma and provide access to additional resources for families. This is one, to provide those resources, but also to show them that they are families who you're interested in serving, that they are welcome at your school, at your library, at your community-based organization. Caregivers also talked about organizational barriers like hours of operation, proximity to public transit, and childcare. So this is to say, as facilitators, if you're able to provide evening hours or weekend hours, that likely makes it more welcoming and more accessible for Black and ethnically minoritized caregivers. If you're able to, we're meeting right now over Zoom. If you're able to facilitate any conversations with caregivers or youth via Zoom or online, that often helps. Also, if you are providing services or engaging with the community in face-to-face capacity, providing opportunities for childcare. So if you're a volunteer at a high school and you're going to after school activity, for example, making sure that there are opportunities for caregivers to be involved, that there are opportunities for siblings to be involved, that you're providing childcare. And again, thinking about extended family members and how they can also be engaged in these services. Public transportation is a difficult one if you're not directly on the bus line or the train line, for example. But things that organizations can do are to provide bus tokens and bus passes. If you are providing mental health services, you can accept Medicaid, and Medicaid also comes with a service called the Medicaid van, that if you're able to provide caregivers information about, you can help empower them to utilize the Medicaid van to attend to their various appointments. Clients, so in this case, caregivers, did talk about barriers to them receiving services. So those are things like stigma. So I don't want to be called a bad parent, but also stigma that might impact their kids, right? So I don't want them being diagnosed with ADHD, for example. I don't want them being labeled in a way that could follow them throughout emerging adulthood and even adulthood. Also, system mistrust is one that clients talked about. So again, it's important to identify our positions within the system and to identify ourselves as allies and advocates who will help them navigate the system. In terms of discomfort asking questions, it's important to, if you're talking to a caregiver, if you're talking to a kiddo, also present them with frequently asked questions and the answers to those questions in case they have some questions that they're not comfortable asking. In terms of provider barriers, these caregivers did talk about a lack of cultural efficacy that providers had. They talked about misdiagnosis and implicit bias, different things that providers can engage in to kind of offset those barriers are things like engaging in continuing education. I do have an abundance of resources available as well, things to read, watch, and listen to for providers who would like to improve or increase their cultural efficacy. So this is to say that, again, our quantitative results, so the chart review was not surprising in that Black youth are less likely to initiate, engage in, and complete and benefit from mental health services. But our qualitative findings are promising in that they identified strategies that we can utilize to better engage Black clients in trauma-related services, in this case, forensic interviews, but overall in services related to mental health, related to engaging in the community, and related to just coping from interpersonal and racial stress and trauma. And we can do that by making sure that our services are easy to access, making sure that we're delivering them in ways that are representative of Black families in this case, and ensuring that the content is culturally appropriate and designed to overcome barriers. So again, I will be providing you all with links to access our free care package for racial healing that does help overcome these barriers and serve as a facilitator to service access, delivery, and appropriate content for Black youth and families. So the second part of this discussion is to focus on concrete ways that you can integrate racial socialization into, this says cognitive behavioral therapy, but certainly any of the services that you're providing, any of the conversations that you're having with Black youth. So practice is a way to provide TFCBT, so trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. However, the PrAC, or the first essential components, are those that are highlighted in our care package for racial healing as beneficial to all Black youth, whether or not they are experiencing ongoing racial trauma or whether or not they are seeking services for racial stress and trauma. So again, this is based on research that I conducted with clinicians, African-American youth, and African-American caregivers, really to talk about the benefit of discussing racial stress and racial trauma. And this portion of the presentation is just really to validate your experiences and your concerns as volunteers, as service providers, as members of the community who are interacting with Black youth. So common kind of apprehensions are, what if I get upset? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I invalidate the kiddos' experiences? Again, I do want to validate you that all of these things might happen, that we do have strategies for overcoming each of these kind of things that might happen, but that the worst thing that could happen is that you never talk about race at all. So I want to provide just a few concrete strategies for allowing you to have these conversations, talking about race and ethnicity with your kiddos and with your caregivers, and conclude by, again, providing those resources for you all. So the first thing that is important to do when engaging Black families and Black youth and caregivers in conversations around racial stress and trauma is to just provide psychoeducation. So psychoeducation is to normalize, to discuss, and to learn about racial stress and racial trauma, to normalize our common reactions to racial stress and trauma. So no, you're not crazy. No, you're not non-compliant. No, you're not oppositional and defiant, right? But to normalize kiddos' responses to racial stressors and to discuss their values and their expectations around therapy and their interactions with you within your various roles. You conduct psychoeducation by asking open-ended questions, by expanding and clarifying, reading a book or an article and discussing them with your kiddos and caregivers, also sending them with those things home so that they can continue those conversations. You should also play games with the kiddos and with the caregivers, like, what do you know? So again, all of these are resources that are available to you in the care package for racial healing. These are different vocabulary that you can start to use and to ask kiddos, what do you know about racial trauma, racial identity? What do you know about your mental and behavioral health? What values do you have that might impact therapy or our work together or our relationship? So that's things like, what happens in the family should stay in the family. You can also ask about their ongoing experiences with mental health, therapy, their experiences within the system. If you are older, you can ask them about how they're perceiving you as an older person. If you're white, you can ask them how they're experiencing you as a white individual, right? So you can use aspects of your identity to provide psychoeducation as well. In this case as well, this is in your care package. So ways to discuss fight, flight, and freeze responses. On here should also be the fawn response, but I'll discuss that here shortly. So this is to say that you could just ask kiddos about the racial stressors that they've experienced and then ask about ways that they reacted. And then you can conclude by validating whatever reaction that they talk about and normalize their reaction, while also providing psychoeducation on the various types of responses. So for example, what's a recent or significant racial stressor that you experience? They can say, some kids in class told me that I could play with them because my skin's too dark and my hair is nappy. You can ask a kid how they responded. One kid might say, I got in an argument with them. You normalize their fight response. One kid might say, I left the playground altogether and I didn't play with anyone. Normalize their flight response. Another might say, I didn't know what to do or what to say, so I just kind of stood there, and they went on with what they were doing. Normalize their freeze response. So no, you're not angry. No, you're not a coward. No, you're not slow to respond. These are all normal reactions to racial stressors. Excuse me. The fawn response is one where they might say, I didn't really fight or run away or freeze, but I kind of just laughed it off or played it off. And that's one that you can normalize and validate as well. Again, there's a separate page in your care package that talks about fight, flight, and freeze responses and ways to normalize these while providing psychoeducation for Black youth and caregivers. I'm going to pause for 1 second to blow my nose again, sorry. We're going to talk about relaxation here shortly. Okay, sorry about that. If you're doing any editing in post, you can certainly cut that out. But in moving forward to our discussion of relaxation, it's important for coping with stress as it allows us to practice self-care and to recharge as we do know, working twice as hard to get ahead. It's important to restructure our thoughts around our ability to, our desire to, as well as our need to relax. So I do know that in a lot of Black households, what you'll hear is, we don't sleep in. That's a sign of laziness, for example. I don't have the ability to, or I can't afford to relax because I am the caretaker, right? So it's important when we talk about relaxation to normalize those cultural backgrounds and values around relaxation and how we respond to stress, but also to combat that with, okay, if you are working twice as hard, you need to rest and relax twice as much. If you are the caretaker for your family, if you are the strong Black woman in your family, for example, you're not able to take care of people if you haven't first taken care of yourself. And I say strong Black woman, but this is teenagers, right? These are the kiddos and the youth that you're interacting with as well. Just making sure if you have a youth who seems stressed out, who seems overworked, who seems hypervigilant, who is experiencing any of these signs of racial stress and racial trauma, that you're talking to them about ways that they relax and that you're talking to them. Remember, racial socialization talks about extended family involvement and talks about religiosity. So talk to them about the ways that religion, for example, prayer, giving thanks, might allow them to take some time out for themselves. Also to talk about ways that their extended family, so cousins, play cousins, friends, who can help you relax? How can you build that into your relaxation time? These are just some common relaxation strategies that you can use, that you can encourage you to engage in, and that you can add to their toolbox or their makeup bag or however they think about their relaxation strategies. I like to call it a care package, since most of the kids that I've been working with are now using our care package for racial healing. And they just add these relaxation strategies into their care package. Affect identification is important as well, as it pertains to being able to recognize and communicate our feelings and our emotions related to experiences of interpersonal and racial stress and trauma. As we remember earlier when I talked about how negative feelings can be a result of these experiences is really important to communicate their feelings and then start to tolerate those distressing emotions and to regulate those distressing emotions. So yes, we recognize that we tolerate and regulate them, and then we're able to change the thoughts that we have that are negative, that are inaccurate, or that are otherwise harmful. So as it pertains to affect identification, ways that you can do this, again, is just playing a game. In this case, you can start with just a list of feelings. You can give kiddos 2 minutes even that says, name as many feelings as you can in the next 2 minutes, and I'm going to write them all down. And once they've done that, you can talk about each feeling that they've named, and you can get them to tell you a time when they're mad, and you can get them to tell you a time when they were mad in relation to their race or something that someone has said or done or something that they've seen in relation to a racial stressor. And you do that with each of the feelings. So mad, sad, hopeless, but also the positive feelings, happy, excited, proud. When was the last time you felt proud because of your race or ethnicity? And get them to be able to identify and label those emotions. Putting them all together. So cognitive restructuring is kind of the last component of what it takes to validate, recognize, communicate, and then overcome these racial stressors. So you do that through cognitive restructuring, which allows us to restructure our responses. So this is not restructuring our perception of what it is that kiddos are experiencing, right? We're not restructuring it to be, maybe that wasn't racism or a racial stressor. Maybe you were being sensitive, or maybe it was your teacher being tired, right? We're not restructuring what happened. We're restructuring kiddos' responses. And that happens when you help the kiddos distinguish between their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors. You help them understand how racial stressors and racism is what leads to inaccurate thoughts. So racism is what has you thinking that you're lazy or that this will never end. Racism is what has you experiencing these distressing feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, anger. And racism is what led to these problematic behaviors like you fighting or acting out, or you disengaging from this extracurricular activity. And then the goal of cognitive restructuring is this that you see in brown, is to build on those opposite actions. So if you're feeling angry, instead of fighting, instead of punching, instead of getting in a physical or verbal altercation, how else could you respond to not let them win or to not let racism win? If you want to fight, if you're a fighter, maybe you fight by writing a letter. Maybe you fight by sending an email. Maybe you fight by calling a district attorney's office, right? What other ways can we fight that lead to the goals that you ultimately have and that doesn't let racism win? So these are just things that you do not do when you're trying to engage in cognitive coping. So don't ignore it. Don't do nothing. Don't sidetrack the conversation. Yes, Mary, I appreciate that. So these kids are certainly feeling the effects of the ways in which racism is impacting them at all levels of their being and all levels of their interaction in society. So kids in school who are not having their history taught do need to have their history taught when they come home from school. And a lot of that is the works that we're able to do as community members and as caregivers. It's critically important that if they're not having these conversations in school, for us to be able to teach them after school or the weekends to supplement their lack of exposure to the ways in which racism is perpetuated across all different systems. So as we are helping to kind of restructure their responses, it's really important to provide that education for kiddos and to provide that language, vocabulary, and coping strategies that will allow them to navigate these ongoing and perpetual racial stressors. So the way that we do this is through a process called Black. And that is to say, we breathe, we locate where it is that we're feeling the stressor in our body, and that we're asking and communicating around ways to respond more proactively. So breathing, we know what that looks like. Take a deep breath. There are resources available in the Google Drive link that I'll share with you all that talk about ways to teach deep breathing and progressive muscle relaxation for those kiddos who need it. Also find exactly in your body where you feel your stress and relax it. So that's where progressive muscle relaxation is really important. So some people might clench their jaws. Some people might tense their fists. Some people's leg might start bouncing. So just get your kiddos able to recognize where their stress is expressed in their bodies and get them to practice tensing and relaxing it so that they can reduce some of those physical manifestations like stress, yes, but also hypertension, high blood pressure, chronic fatigue, grinding of teeth, all of these kind of behavioral responses that we know are a result of racial stressors. And then asking and communicating. These are vocabulary that you can use with the kids to ask them questions, but these are also questions that they can use as they're navigating these racial stressors. So what do you mean by that? Who are you referring to when you say that? What does that mean about the way all Black people talk, think, look, act, right? So asking questions that, one, are out of curiosity, but two, are able to identify a racial stressor more concretely in order to reduce some of that ambiguity that leads to some of the symptoms of anxiety that we might see. Asking kiddos directly, what emotions are you feeling? Where are you feeling them? What self-talk is going on in your head? So self-talk, those are the thoughts that we're having. So what thoughts are you having? And then it's our job to identify those that are negative or inaccurate and to restructure them. How might this be interpreted by others? So this is not to make up an excuse for someone else, but this is to validate the experiences. That's to say, right, to normalize those fight and freeze responses. What strategies have you talked about as a family? What strategies have you tried? So a lot of times you're going to have a strategy or have a suggestion that kiddos are going to say that they've already tried and that hasn't worked. So it's really important to ask these questions so that you're meeting them where you're at and so that you can help problem solve and empower them and validate them for already attempting to navigate these racial stressors on their own as you are stepping in to provide additional support. This is where you can also ask, what else can you try? Is there anyone else you feel comfortable discussing these issues with? So this could be, again, mom, dad, siblings, also extended family, coworkers, classmates, ombudsmen, school counselors, school volunteers, Corinda, different lawyers who you have contact or access to. And then last, you can also ask, of course, how can I be of support? That's a really important question. Oftentimes kids are more hesitant to ask for help, but if you offer that help and ask them how you can be of support, it's likely that they'll start to receive it and start to ask for it as well. So this is an example of how racial socialization can help in response to these racial stressors at school and how the conversation and the process of Black can help restructure typical responses. So initially, the triggering event is you finish a group project and everyone in your group gets acknowledged but you. So this is the kid who says, I worked really hard on this. Everyone got good grades. Our teacher highlighted everyone's contributions, but it's like I was invisible. You talk to this kiddo and their first thought might be, I didn't do a good job on this project. Of course, it's a reflection of my performance, right? So this is a kid who has internalized racism in this case as a reflection of their own performance. They might feel embarrassed. They might feel angry. They might feel hurt. Certainly, they might feel discouraged, right? What will they do? They might speak up less. They might stop volunteering altogether for group projects. If they get assigned to a group project, they might disengage and stop participating, right? Through going through the process of Black, allowing them to breathe, locate where it is that they're feeling this stressor in their body, and asking and communicating questions around, tell me about the demographics of people in your class. It might be that they're the only girl in the group. And in that case, it's not racism, it's sexism likely. It might be that they're the youngest or the most quiet. It might be that, any sort of thing. But if it turns out that they are the only Black person in this group or the only Black person in this class, or if you're able to identify this as a racial stressor, you could talk to the client, you could talk to your kiddo about racism, provide psychoeducation around racism in schools, and empower them to know this often happens when there's only one Black person in a group or in a class. Label it as a racist encounter, label it as a micro invalidation, for example. Your teacher might not have overtly been ignoring you or leaving you out, but they certainly did invalidate your contribution to this group activity. And once you've labeled it and identified their overall goals, right? So you're asking questions around their goals for participating in group activities, their goals for going to college, their goals for their future. You're able to leave them feeling more determined, more confident, more proud of themselves. You ask them about what it is that they actually contributed to the group project. Now their feelings are more positive about themselves and their own contribution. Also ask them about other people in their class who could advocate for how much work they did on the group performance. In this case, they could send a reminder of their contribution. Maybe you have a kiddo who says, I already tried that and I got it written up. My teacher told me I was talking back. In this case, continue asking and communicating. Is there anyone in your group who recognizes your contribution, who might advocate for you? Maybe it's time for your parent or caregiver to write a letter. Maybe it's time for me to talk to the teacher or to the school counselor or to facilitate a discussion. But you see, in this case, you go from a kid who is disengaged, no longer volunteering, no longer interacting, to someone who's advocating for themselves and more likely to continue benefiting from the educational experience. The example that I want to present in terms of racial stressors in the community is a common example: getting pulled over by the police. This happens and a kiddo's first thought is, I've seen this happen on the news. I saw Philando Castile. I saw George Floyd. I saw, right? I'm going to get shot and killed because that's what they do to Black people. This kiddo is now more anxious. They're more fearful. They might even be angry in response. They might be making sudden movements. They might act out of character. Certainly, they might experience elevated heart rate. They might start to have some of these behavioral and physical responses that are negative. Through the process of breathe, locate, ask, and communicate, what sorts of conversations have you had as a family around what to do if you get pulled over by the police? What sorts of things have we talked about around what to do if you get pulled over by the police? Where are you feeling your stressors in your body? How can you respond? You can take a child from being afraid to feeling like, yes, there's heightened racial tension, but I do know how to respond because I have been prepared by these previous conversations. You, in that case, would feel more controlled, more calm. You're engaging in the proactive behaviors, your hands at 10 and 2, you're responding with yes, no, officer, And PMR here. PMR, again, is that behavioral strategy that you have access to in the care package. You have a script for practicing that with yourselves and with your kiddos. It's a process of tensing and relaxing your emotions that allows individuals to calm down their body's physiological response to stressors. What we know about these police interactions, if you think about death from 1,000 cuts, right? It's not just one large interaction. It's not just that knee to the neck or that bullet that might be killing us. It's also these shortened, these non-violent interactions that lead to fear, that lead to, again, high blood pressure, hypertension, these physical responses that do take days and years off of our lives. You're welcome, Annie. So this is to say, you can engage. It says PMR here, but the kiddos that I work with, they just call it, we was in the car squeezing our booty cheeks. And when you read PMR, you're going to see that you go from your jaws to your hands to your shoulders, all the way down to your hips and your glutes. But whatever it is that you're able to do to allow them to practice PMR, we do know that that's a strategy that helps behaviorally as well as physically in response to racial stressors. Excuse me. So this is the fun part of the presentation. This is the end of the presentation where I'm basically going to throw a ton of free resources at you guys, and I'm going to orient you to where all of them are. So if you go to drishametzger.com/online resources, you will see a ton of resources for caregivers, for Black youth, for practitioners, clinicians, and providers. The first set are towards healing from interpersonal and racial stressors. So there are things that you can watch. There are things that they can read. So for example, the Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health, A Burst of Light. You saw a quote from Audre Lorde earlier in the presentation. There's also a family and community self-care toolkit that you could provide access to. So for those who don't like to read or to watch things, there's also a ton that you can listen to in terms of podcasts, instrumentals, and just audio versions of resources for healing from racial stressors. If you want resources around being an ally and an advocate, those are also available. There are things to watch, to read, for example, how to be an anti-racist. So you want to talk about race, we have access to all of those. These that links are provided to are also there. So for example, a white parent's guide to talking about race. For those kiddos and caregivers who are disengaging civically, who have feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, there are lists of police reform and different progress that has been made since George Floyd's protests began in 2020. So these are to show the benefits of good trouble, right? How do we fight in ways that, how do we engage in ways that, excuse me, help eradicate racism and help do some of this anti-racist work. And again, here are resources and things that you can listen to. For those of you who are interested in training in TFCBT, this is available at tfcbt2.musc.edu. As I mentioned, I am one of the trainers on this this website, and there's a 2 there, and that indicates that if you do the 2 version, you're doing the version that has me and that has all of the cultural considerations in there for engaging ethnically minoritized youth. The second resource that you can see, I think I have that separately. So let's continue. Public health messaging. So these are the messages that I mentioned are available. We have this in red. We also have this in blue. If you go to drishametzger.com/public health campaign, you're able to access any of these messaging. And if you send us an email at theempowerlab@gmail.com, we will provide these to you for free. You can feel free to print them off online if you want, but you'll see what the free versions look like. These are around engaging in allyship and activism, ways to unplug. The QR codes all lead back to our racial trauma guide. This is what they look like. So if you want to print them out, you can. If you want the yard size, these are more sturdy. These are 18 by 24. Like I mentioned, you could put these outside of your library. You could put these outside of the schools. You could put these outside of your homes even. And the QR codes, again, this is a racial trauma guide. So the racial trauma guide is at drishametzger.com/racial trauma guide. And there's information here around coping with racial trauma, talking to children about race and racism. Yes, here's the site. All of them are on drishametzger.com. They're just different tabs, Corinda. So the one for the public health campaign is drishametzger.com/public-health-campaign. But if you start from drishametzger.com, you'll be able to navigate to the racial trauma guide as well. That has those separate resources for allies. And then this is the one that I'm most excited about. This is the one that you have access to for free online, but if you'd like to get a print copy, you can also contact us for that. It's drishametzger.com/care package for racial healing. So this is what allows, you'll see a lot of the information that I presented on earlier today is available in the care package. It's quite lengthy. It's over 50 pages long, but it is a workbook that you're able to provide page by page. For example, if you just want to provide psychoeducation or racial stressors, you can tear out those pages or you can print out those pages. And then the coping strategies are in there as well. But the care package stands for cultivating awareness and resilience through empowerment. So they are self-directed cognitive, emotional, and behavioral skills that Black youth and families can use, and that you all are able to disseminate to those Black youth, and you can help them work through these either with you or again with their extended family members. If you're interested in the research that I presented today, I do have a tab on my website, drishametzger.com/research, or the easiest way is to follow us on Instagram, instagram.com/theempowerlab. We do research spotlights every Friday that talk about our different research articles from like-minded researchers as well that highlight results and strategies that are relevant for Black youth and families. Also, I have a podcast called Black and Empowered Podcast that discusses physical, mental, and behavioral health as it relates to Black excellence and racial stress and trauma. I do interview my friends and colleagues. We have conversations with community members. The podcast is where you are able to, again, if you prefer listening rather than reading, engage in some of these ongoing conversations around, again, racial stress and trauma, but really our podcast focuses on kind of Black excellence and healing despite those instances. I did mention following us on social media. We are at the Empower Lab everywhere. We also just started a brand new social media page around the care package and resources relevant for Black families. That's actually not in the presentation yet, but if you go to Instagram at black.and.empowered, you're able to engage in some of those ongoing conversations. And I do have a ton of people to thank. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you. I do think that these resources will benefit you as you engage in your ongoing work, but also as you engage in kind of coping and healing from racial stressors in your own homes and in your own lives. The main people that I want to thank are the University of Georgia, as well as the Empower Lab and Georgia State University. We have a racial trauma task force that started off as 9 individuals and that has increased vastly over the last 2 years. And Corinda, I think you have a question, but I want to take this time now to just open for ongoing conversation. I think I heard you jump off mute.
Well, Dr. Metzger, you have just filled us. I mean, I cannot tell you how much that information has been just instrumental in the work that we're trying to do. So excited to have heard you, and just the resources alone was worth the time. Can we take a moment though to pose any questions we'd like to have? This is a rare treat for you to have access to Dr. Metzger. So if you are with us today and you have a question, please feel free to come off mute and ask that question.
Yes.
I'm gonna come off. I'm Annie, and I was I'm doing in the other arm of Coogee. We are working with the library and the School of Public Health and this the Collaborative Center for Health Equity. And so we're starting a project called Healing Labs and taking them into schools. We're working with partnership with the Medicine Public Library and the school district. So I was looking for resources for the Healing Lab, and I came across this. And so I said, oh, this would be great for Juneteenth, and to bring you back. And that's why I thought about Dr. Gloria, who is our community expert on a lot of these kind of things about how to educate our children. And so while I'm sitting here having both of you on the same screen, I thought, okay, we need to bring this back in a bigger way, maybe at the beginning of the school year where people are, no, we just got graduations and all kinds of stuff. And then maybe we can get a better outcome because I think it's worth it. And so we're going to be back in contact with you. And maybe I'll let Dr. Gloria kind of be a point person because she's sharp and how we can work
She's just
together.
recruiting me to do more work. You see
Yes,
that?
but helping in terms of, because I'm a visionary, so I get ideas. So then I need detail persons to help it come into fruition. So this was the idea. And he said, this is a great idea. And I have Abby, I think, Abby and Corinda. Corinda is a part of our Juneteenth committee, and Abby is a part of my library team. And so bringing this back where we can really target educators and people who are working with our kids as well, and get a little bit more parents, because we are working with the Family, Youth, and Engagement coordinators arm of the school district as well. So I really want to bring this back, because I still just like look at all of the resources. I still go through it because I am really, I'm touched by that resource. And so thank you. And I wanted to say that, but in terms of when you probably, I don't know if you read some of our statistics, where we have a lot of our educators and a lot of our people who work with our kids come from a deficit model. And not necessarily see the kids as individuals. We've got this concept that all Black kids are not developing, not educated, not learning, and come from cold backgrounds. Do you have any way that this resource and tool could be helpful in terms of helping to contradict that?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It needs to just be done away with. The deficit model, the deficit approach is completely what I would say is opposite to positive psychology and what we know about resilience, and that even these youth who are demonstrating some of these negative outcomes do have individual as well as family and community strengths that we should otherwise emphasize in order to help them navigate the education system, navigate society. So I would just say to take the opposite approach and to emphasize the opposite approach of individual and cultural strengths. So just taking a strengths-based approach and a strengths-based perspective will allow them to highlight those kind of ongoing strategies and protective processes, particularly racial socialization, that I do think is so beneficial for Black youth.
Yeah, I would just say that one of the things I thought was most important in your presentation was what we can do. I think sometimes we tend to want to talk about what they are doing.
Right.
But I think you gave so many positive examples of what, number one, we need to stop doing in terms of fomenting the sort of internalized racism. And number two, the things we can do in terms of racial socialization. I think more than anything, our community needs to hear that.
Yeah, I think the main thing that I try to emphasize is our kind of individual and community's ability to empower ourselves and to work against racism. Racism is perpetual, it's historical, right?
Yeah. And it's real, it's real.
It's very real.
But I loved how you really kind of focused on the locus of control here. I think one of the things that stresses folks out is this feeling of being out of control.
Right, that hopelessness. And really my question then is, okay, what can we do to not let racism win? And what can we do to utilize your individual strengths? So if you're a fighter, I'm going to validate that, but how can we fight in a way that allows us to, like John Lewis talks about, good trouble, right? How can we get into good trouble by fighting? If you are someone who prefers to disengage, how can you, while disengaging and setting those appropriate boundaries, right? I'm not telling you to go to a KKK rally, but how can you disengage and then re-engage with those in your local family? And how can you, within your small circle, empower yourselves to overcome individually and to heal individually and to thrive as a family and as a community despite, right? So what we don't want to do is just focus on racism as this big bad thing and say it's winning, right? But to, yes, eradicate racism, but really empower ourselves to smile and to rest and to restore despite.
And what I appreciate about that is also is that you are also validating what they're experiencing, but also giving them solutions to those experiences.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm getting a message from our tech person that we are coming up on our next session. So I don't want to step on that person's presentation, but Dr. Metzger, we cannot thank you enough. And I know you were not feeling well and you just, soldiered on. You're reinforcing the stereotype of a strong Black woman, but we just hope you feel better. We thank you. And Annie, I hope we will be able to use this recording over and over again because so many people need to hear that.
Yes,
that message.
Please. Thank you guys for your patience. This is not how I like to present. I'm typically way more dynamic and energetic. Please, please, please stay in touch. Also, this was an hour and a half. I'm sure Gloria, you just said you got done with training. This is like a 2-day training that I condensed for you guys.
Yeah.
So please, please stay in touch. And I look forward to continuing these conversations with you all.
Thank you so much. And thank you for those of you who were able to tune in. Please share this information with your friends and colleagues, family and loved ones, because it's so important.
Yes.
Thank you all, and be aware that there are just tons of Juneteenth activities between now and Sunday. So follow the website and pay attention to the announcements. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.